Hello there and welcome to the Secrets of Organ Playing podcast. I'm your host, Vidas Pinkevicius. Today's guest is Pamela Ruiter-Feenstra, a very dear friend of mine and my teacher at Eastern Michigan University when I was studying for my second master's degree there. And she is very well known to the organ world as a great improviser, and she is very much interested in historical improvisational techniques, and also she is a composer, a teacher, organist, and in general very inspirational figure. Today I would like to talk about her most recent project, Bach and the Art of Improvisation, Volume 1, which was published in 2011. So I hope this conversation will reveal some of her ideas into the world of historically based improvisation techniques, and I hope it will inspire at least some of you to try your hand at improvising in the style of Bach. Let's go to the show. Thank you so much for doing this interview. So I'm thrilled to have you here on this conversation, and I was really excited to talk to you about Bach and the Art of Improvisation, your book, your treatise, basically, Volume 1.
Well, thank you, Vidas, for your interest and for your work with improvisation. It's always wonderful to talk with a kindred spirit.
Thank you so much. Let me start this conversation with asking you how you first fell in love with the organ and with improvisation in general. Maybe you remember a special moment in your life that you could share with our listeners. Thank you.
Yes, I started playing the organ when I was in grade 8. I had taken piano lessons, and my piano teacher was also an organist, and the church needed some organists, and so I just started taking lessons. And I also went to schools where children sang in the classroom, so I had been playing hymns and folk songs and things in the classroom from 3rd grade on, and I always loved the connection between a keyboard instrument and the human voice, and especially so once I started playing the organ, if it was a pipe organ, because of the breathing that it corresponds with the winding of the organ. And but as a child, I improvised. I would practice my piano lessons, and then I would listen to recordings that my parents had, and I would play one track of a recording and then go to the piano and try to see if I could play what I had heard. So it was great ear training, really. I was just trying to figure out what was going on in the music and how other people made music.
Yes, just by playing other pieces, right? And you started to analyze them and you started to decipher them so that you could later understand and better comprehend it. That's wonderful, Pamela. I remember how we first met, right? It was in Göteborg International Organ Academy back in 2000. Yes. With Oshera, we were participants, and I remember you were the first basically organ professor who greeted us and showed us around, and we made this wonderful contact, and immediately we of course thought that you were so inspiring person and teacher that we would love to know more about your teaching style, your inspirations, and you did teach us later at EMU, at Eastern Michigan University, for our master's degree. So it was a very, very exciting journey for both of us, for Osha and me. And it all started in Sweden, in Gothenburg International Organ Academy. So thank you so much, Pamela, for your inspiration.
It's just a wonderful colleagueship that I enjoy with you in Osha, and friendship as well. Yes, so the improvisation then that I did as a child, I continued to do in the practice room when I first went to college.
Yes.
And but I listened outside the practice room doors, and I noticed, I don't think anyone else is improvising. And it occurred to me, maybe professional musicians don't improvise. Because I had been taking these recordings and not only figuring out how somebody else created the music, then once I figured that out, I would make variations on it. And I continued to do that until I thought no one else is improvising, so maybe I should stop. And so I stopped for 2 years when I was between my freshman and junior year in college. And then I went to Dordt College, which is a Dutch immigrant school in Northwest Iowa. And the organ professor there, Joan Ringerwall, invited Klaas Bolt from Haarlem, the Netherlands, to come and offer a psalm fest. And Klaas Bolt came, and he used the organ and made those people sing better than I've ever heard anyone sing before. And I was so interested all along in him playing. That's what I loved about the organ, was being able to build community in this way, that everyone joined together could create something more than what each individual could be by themselves. And that's what he did. And then he improvised in the hymns, he improvised before and after the hymns, he improvised organ works based on the Genevan Psalms. And I was just in heaven. I thought, this is organ playing. This is communication. This is what every musician needs to know. And from that moment on, then I became very passionate about advocating improvisation, because I realized, it's not that professional musicians shouldn't improvise. It's just that they haven't had the opportunity to learn how. But imagine what it could do to their musicianship if they can learn how to improvise. So that started the path of improvisation pedagogy. I had to figure that out.
Well, that's amazing story. Thank you so much, Pamela, for sharing it with us. You know, people from probably all over the world are listening to us when this conversation will go live, and they can't help but wonder about your fascination with historical improvisation. By historical, I mean that you try to recreate the techniques and methods and practices that people used, one might say, 300 years ago or 400 years ago. You know, like this is very, very old technique, but today, even in 21st century, it might come alive, right, under your fingers.
Yes, well, and I've had many people say, why start with Bach and that era? Because Bach is difficult. It's very complex harmonically. And I've experimented with different students and also with myself to try to improvise in the various styles, in a modern style and in a French romantic style, various 20th century ideas. And I tried doing that without the foundation of the 18th century. But I was teaching music theory from my very first university position at Bethany College in Lindsborg, Kansas. I had my load was both organ, harpsichord, as well as sacred music and music theory. And so I was very acquainted with all these different theory texts and theory approaches, and they all started really with the 18th century harmony. And the goal was to be able to analyze Bach chorales. And I thought, well, it makes perfect sense. I mean, improvisation requires a great deal of knowledge about theory to have the improvisation start where the theory is often begun in terms of pedagogy. And when I worked with students, starting with Bach and understanding 18th century harmony and melody and linear counterpoint and how the voice is connected both horizontally and vertically, the results of the improvisations were at a much higher quality when it was just a little freer trying to meander through a toccata by having fast figures in the fingers, but then the harmony lacked substance, and often the piece itself lacked direction and form. But starting with Bach chorales, it just made a lot of sense. So although Bach didn't write a treatise, right, to do a lot of research in terms of looking at quotes by Bach's pupils, looking at the materials we do have from Bach's hand and from his pupils' hands, and then studying very carefully his music and how he composed his music, and the descriptions of how he improvised and how he taught improvisation, so that I could reconstruct a pedagogy using 18th century harmony, but the pedagogy that was comprehensive musicianship, that connected every aspect of musicianship into the study and the pedagogy of improvisation.
And you did write in your book, Bach and the Art of Improvisation, at least in the first volume that is now published, right? And it took about 10 years to publish these ideas in a form of the book, but it really represents a lifetime of your experience in experimentation, teaching and researching, performing and improvising. I'm citing now Joel Spearstra that he wrote in the foreword for your book. So I'm really excited today to know more about this book, about what kind of ideas you explore. Could you share a little bit this exciting topic?
Well, and you mentioned Sweden. I'm most grateful to Go Art, to Hans Davidsson, to Joel Spearstra, Bob Peters, my colleagues there, who were so supportive in encouraging me to continue investigating this and to turn this into a book so that it could be used by other people. And it was thanks to my time at Go Art that this idea of putting this into a book came about, with Hans Davidsson's encouragement. And I had time there to try these ideas out with colleagues from around the world, an international group of researchers and performers and organ builders, and then also with students in Göteborg at the university there, and students at Smarano. I taught in Italy at this clavichord academy that Giacomo Corra puts on, and I know you've been interested in that as well. But it took years and years of trying out the ideas, because I think really the only way to come up with ideas that work and are well tested is to make a lot of mistakes along the way. And I had to make these mistakes to be able to say, okay, that didn't work. So what can I learn from that can work the next time? And thankfully, students and every student I've had has seen me make mistakes and has helped me to know how to teach better, how to come up with a more coherent pedagogical method of improvisation. And it's all that testing and learning from the mistakes that eventually came to this Bach and the Art of Improvisation, Volume 1.
Well, before we talk about this volume of your improvisation treatise, you mentioned that the performer or improviser has to be not afraid of mistakes. Can you elaborate a little bit? Because I know many people who want to try improvise or improvisation in various styles, not only in the Bach style, but even in the Bach style, or especially in the Bach style, they are afraid that they will never reach this dream, right? Because Bach was alpha and omega, basically, for musicians. We start with Bach, and we probably will end with Bach at the end of our life. So, how can you deal with this, with the fear of failure, fear of making mistakes as an improviser? I know you somehow conquered this fear, so I'm really curious what you say.
It takes a childlike attitude, and since publishing the Bach and the Art of Improvisation I have spent a great deal of time with children because I realize that this fear factor is so present in professional musicians because they want to be able to improvise at the level they play improvisation, but they have put thousands of hours into practicing their the level they play repertoire, excuse me. They put thousands of hours into practicing the repertoire, and it really takes that same investment of time to learn how to improvise at that same high level. And so it's a humbling experience. It means having a beginner's mind again, and being playful and daring to laugh, and that didn't sound good. Well, let's see, what could I do to change that to make it sound better? To be able to laugh and have a sense of humor about it, and whoops, that one went off the cliff, but okay, but the first part worked. I'll take that first part and try another direction. And you see this in children. If you watch small children playing, they don't give up. If something doesn't work, if they're stacking blocks and something doesn't work, they just try another way. They don't say, I can't do it after one try.
Exactly.
They just keep trying. And it's that beginner's mind, that openness of a child without any expectations that it has to sound like this. It has to sound like my repertoire playing, or it has to sound like another organist or another improviser I know. Just the beauty of, listen to those three notes.
Exactly.
Those three notes are fantastic together. And another bonus to listening at that tiny level, it's like watching ants on a sidewalk. It means that our ears are much more open to hearing sound and the way we produce sound. And if I'm only listening to three notes, if I'm playing that on the organ or the clavichord or the harpsichord or the piano or on a wind or stringed instrument, what was that sound like? Could I make it bloom more? Could I give it more direction? Could I give it more affect? Is it communicating? And then just asking all of these questions about those three notes. And pretty soon they're five notes. And pretty soon those five notes are joined by another voice. And then it becomes a phrase. And then we've accomplished a phrase today. And then let's celebrate that phrase. And just taking those tiny steps and feeling joyful and satisfied with those steps. It's like trying a new wonderful food and being able to really savor it in a way that the professional food tasters or wine tasters do. Just savor these little bits of music. And then once we have enough little bits of music, we can start putting them together into a brief piece.
That's right. So it's all about communicating and storytelling, isn't it, Pamela?
Yes. Do you remember the storytelling we used to do in improvisation classes?
I was just going to bring up this subject because right now I'm working with storytelling in organ improvisation. So it basically, thanks to you, Pamela, you introduced me to the larger world of storytelling through musical means, and it continues to touch my practices and through me other listeners as well. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. I'm so delighted that you're bringing to life new tales, old tales really, from Lithuania. And making those known to the world, and also communicating through music in this way. I think this is fabulous.
And not only from Lithuania. For example, you can even improvise on. I did just recently on the Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Little Mermaid, and it's such a beautiful story, right? And so many ways to depict this intricate adventure and fairly sad story in music, right? So I'm very, very grateful to you that you introduced me and others in this class that we were together at EMU. I remember we improvised on the story about the musicians of Bremen, right? It was such an exciting musical adventures. We used all kinds of keyboard instruments that were present in this class, in this hall, basically organ, harpsichord, piano, harmonium, what else? Basically all that was available, and we even performed it in front of the group of kindergartners, right? So that was really, really amazing, I think.
Yes, and if it's with character-rich stories especially, it's possible to do so much. If there are several characters and each one of them has a strong personality, and then you can give that personality a really strong affect or set of affects with your themes that you create with improvisation. It's just so dynamic, and it communicates in ways that I think many other just composed pieces aren't able to tell the story to that degree. Heavens, Greek mythology, I mean, it's infinite, the possibilities.
Exactly, and the subject and the musical ideas basically doesn't have to be modern or 21st century, right? Like we do sometimes if we use French modal techniques on the organ, or even rhythms that are too complex for the Baroque period. But we can remember that Johann Kuhnau, just basically contemporary of Johann Sebastian Bach, wrote biblical sonatas, right? 6 biblical sonatas, which were basically musical storytelling through musical ideas about the David and Goliath, right? About the healing of soul, right? And this was amazing when I discovered. So I hope you also incorporate this in your teaching.
Yes, I think it's a wonderful way to free up the improvisation as well, because suddenly the improviser is thinking so much about the story and the characters, and not in that left hemisphere of the brain. So that's the right hemisphere, creative part, and the left hemisphere of the brain is analytical, which is important for improvisation, but it can also have a lot of critique and judgment, and that's not so helpful all the time for the flow of the improvisation. So I think, the storytelling is a wonderful outlet. I used to do this on a regular basis with Keith Hill, the instrument maker, and Marianne Ploger, composer and aural perception specialist, as when they were in Michigan, and they, in their Keith's workshop, he always had numerous harpsichords and forte pianos and instruments. He was making guitars and violins, and so we would get a group of people together, and we would all sit in this workshop, which was perfect because there were wood shavings on the floor and there were unfinished instruments. So it had this atmosphere that this is a work in progress. Our improvisation was that as well. It wasn't as if we were on stage in a finely decorated parlor or something. It was the whole atmosphere was conducive to us just experimenting with improvisation and trying to tell stories as a group, as an improvisation society. So somebody would start and then somebody else would join in and tell more of the story, but it was all done through music.
And Keith Hill, you mentioned, is the famous harpsichord maker, right, from Michigan, and his harpsichords are so well sounding and sweet in character, and they come alive under good harpsichordist fingers, of course, but they are built so beautifully, of course. They are really works of art.
Yes, Keith has studied the art and science of sound profoundly, and he's kind of done something similar with instruments that I've been doing with improvisation, in that he goes to the old instruments and taps on them and listens to the tuning patterns on the wood, and has learned how to create multiple layers of tuning patterns on the instruments to maximize the color and the resonance that they produce. He's now doing this with violins and violas to great success. And yes, his harpsichords are among the most colorful and resonant and clear speaking and affect filled that I've played in modern times, as well as historic instruments.
Yes, so your improvisation treatise is divided into two volumes, right? Volume 1 is basically devoted to chorale-based improvisation, right? And I know that later Volume 2 will focus on other aspects such as continuo and free works, right? Basically, forthcoming work of yours. So can you introduce us a little bit about your work in this on this treatise and what you learned from it?
Yes, this work, again, it came from years of testing this with students and, of course, with myself. I wanted to learn how to become a better improviser. And I thought, why not learn from the best? Learn from Bach. And even if I never achieve Bach's level, I'll never run out of the goals and ideas by searching Bach's music. So why not just jump in and try? And so it starts with discovering patterns, finding sequences, understanding how thorough bass works and how voice leading works, so that putting two voices together, because Bach started teaching with chorales, and he would first give his students a chorale melody with a thorough bass, and they just had to fill in the alto and tenor. So I'm doing the same thing. And then after a while, he took away the soprano and had them make a soprano to a thorough bass, and gave them a chorale melody and had them create the harmony. So step by step, it just over months of time and sometimes years of time, they worked their way into being able to work with melody and harmony simultaneously, and keeping in mind the vertical nature of all of the voices at play, even though they have to also line up horizontally to fit in harmony.
Yes, you just mentioned something that I want to point out, because it's so important, and many, I think, listeners will have this aha moment right now. You mentioned that first Bach gave the cantus firmus chorale melody in the soprano, and also the bass, right? And asked a person, his student, basically to fill in the middle parts, two middle parts, tenor and alto, right? So right. This reminds me of how he himself created, for example, some of the chorale preludes from Orgelbuchlein, right? When he notated first soprano and the bass, the pedal part, in basically larger handwriting, and then later filled in the middle parts, alto and tenor. So what you are doing basically corresponds very well to his own compositional process, not only teaching process, but also how he himself approached composing pieces.
That's right. And what was interesting, I mentioned Klaus Bolt, and Klaus Bolt talked about the Dutch organs and how the Dutch organs were built to lead singing. So they had these vocal principles. You've heard maybe John Brumbaugh talk about the vocal principles of the Dutch organs, but they also had these very strong mutations and reeds, and the Dutch would accompany or lead congregational singing by soloing out a strong reed in the soprano and a strong reed in the pedal, so that those outside voices were actually much more prominent than the inside voices. So they were thinking of this with the Genevan Psalms as well, and it really matches the principles of sound ideally, because if you have a strong foundation, then the overtones from that And you know this from singing in a choir, right? The choirs have a much easier time tuning. So I followed Bach's practice of giving the students a soprano melody, usually a chorale melody, with a thorough bass. And so as they learned how to realize the thorough bass in filling in the alto and tenor, then once they were proficient at that, and by the way, I started with that with 17th century harmonies first, because 17th century harmonies have more root position chords and some first inversion chords, not as many non-harmonic tones, and not as many other inversions, second and third position inversions. And then worked into 18th century harmony into up to the point of Bach chorales, where it's extremely rich harmony and all inversions and all non-harmonic tones included.
So these harmonizations that were done in the 17th century, they're basically examples by Samuel Scheidt, probably from his work, right? Suitable
Sure.
for that.
Yes, and then if you look at the Weimar Tablatur of Johann
Yes.
Pachelbel, that is an intermediate step between the 17th century chorales and then Bach, because those are also rather simply harmonized. And so that, again, like Bach talked about, or Bach's pupils talked about, how he presented everything in incremental steps, so that suddenly, at the end of all their steps, they were able to improvise fugues, and it didn't seem very difficult because it was just one more step on the ladder. But if you jump to fugue without doing all of these layers of building the foundation of thorough bass with root position first inversion chords, and then adding other inversions and non-harmonic tones, working into Bach chorales, and then working through variations, those are all these steps that eventually lead to being able to improvise free works and then ultimately fugue.
So, is to make the students' life easier, you basically give the soprano and the bass, right? And then ask them to fill in the middle parts, alto and the tenor, just like Bach would ask, right?
Exactly.
Excellent. That's a splendid approach. It makes beginner's life so much easier than to add all three lower parts right away, like in modern harmony teaching.
Yes, and it's important, I think, for young musicians or new musicians to be exposed to a lot of very strong bass lines, both hearing them and playing them. So there's the aural and tactile memory, but then also seeing them on the page to add the visual memory and the analytical memory, because a bass line doesn't just, I mean, when one puts a bass line to a melody, not just any note works, and even if the notes sound good, depending on how they relate to the next note or the previous note, I mean, there are so many dynamics here. It's as if it's a family, and each person interacts on the other person, and so we can't take into account just one note, but it's all the dynamics before and after and above and below the notes that exist.
Yes. And what happens next, Pamela? What's the next step after that?
So after the harmonization has been thoroughly practiced, then I do work with a thorough bass alone, and then the improviser can start improvising soprano, alto, and tenor above the bass. And again, emphasizing the outer voices first, and then after that can harmonize the soprano, the chorale melody, by then having a lot of exposure to strong bass lines and being able to understand that certain movements, such as ascending seconds, are typically strong in creating bass lines. Descending fifths or ascending fourths are typically strong because we find these movements in cadences.
Yes.
And then, of course, descending thirds work well to create sequential activity, some sort of direction in the bass line. But there are certain movements that aren't as strong, and particularly depending on what's going on with the soprano, we go through the rules of voice leading and also part writing, such as avoiding parallel fifths and octaves, of course, and avoiding odd intervals, such as the augmented second. That wouldn't sound good melodically within any voice part.
Yes, so you mentioned part writing. Do you recommend students, improvisation students, they would write in something or just extemporaneously try to improvise? Do you recommend writing in something?
Yeah, I think the best improvisers are also composers, and it's really quite important to start by writing to make sure. I mean, this is helpful pedagogically because then when there's an interaction with the teacher and the student, it becomes clear what parts of the part writing and the voice leading the student understands when it's written down, and then the teacher can show which parts are working well and congratulate the student on that, and then also show which parts are not as strong and can be reworked to create something stronger. So that allows some back and forth. That, of course, also works with improvisation with someone who's listening very carefully and can point these same things out. But the advantage is the analytical part is a little easier when there's some paper involved, and then hopefully that analytical portion gets transferred to the ears to be as strong as the eyes are in identifying either strengths or weaknesses in the part writing. So yes, absolutely, writing down is very important. And then I had a wonderful student when I was first teaching who, when she would write papers, or when she would memorize organ works of Bach,
yes,
what she would do is she would she would take a blank sheet of paper and cover the music and then write some of the main entrances. Say it's a fugue. She would write, okay, the fugue comes in on the note A in the alto in this measure. And then she would write those entrances on those blank sheets of paper, and then perhaps where the counter subject would be. She would also do this with more homophonic music, and just show herself where a mode shift might be, or where a change in the form might be, where the B section enters, and then gradually worked her system down from all of these blank sheets of paper with little scribbles on to give her cues as to which voice was coming in where. She worked that down to a small note card, and where the whole piece was summarized on a small note card. And that note card is very similar. What she did, her name is Dr. Melissa Mall. She's got a doctorate in organ, and she's also a music librarian at the University of Nebraska, your alma mater.
Excellent.
And what Melissa did is exactly what the Greek orators used to do, but they wouldn't write it down. They would memorize their speeches in a way where they had the blueprint, the whole structure or architecture, the form of their speech with all their major points stored in what they would consider different rooms of a house, that all tucked inside of their brains. And they would access a room just by one very memorable object, like a blood-soaked skin or something.
That's a very powerful mnemonic device, right? This room, memory room, and you access this room by locating various chambers, and you put your ideas into various chambers and various places. You basically imagine the real life room, right?
Yes, exactly. And this is really what we're doing with improvisation. We're doing the same thing that the Greek orators did. Mm-hmm. They didn't have computers or teleprompters, so they weren't ever reading their speeches. They had to convince their audience through their passion, their affect, and through their organized way of giving a speech with all sorts of rhetorical devices of grabbing the attention of the audience at the very beginning with some sort of very engaging statement with colorful words or some sort of image or a joke perhaps, and then they would continue on to say, this is what I'll talk about, this is some background to it, this is the next step and now I'm going to give you my proposition. And Greek rhetoric worked that way. Bach studied rhetoric. We know that. He even likely taught it because he was also a Latin teacher. And he used this in improvisation, and it becomes much easier. And then I think for the modern day improviser, we can see that connection between the written page, particularly if the improviser composes out some of the assignments for the improvisation, and then studies that written page, tries to reduce it to an outline form that then would be inserted almost like a microchip into the brain. And then that microchip holds all of these rooms in a house, and each room has a different section or concept that of the piece that will be improvised. And the details could come out differently every time. The improvisation can be decorated in an infinite variety of ways. So the details are what's happening spontaneously at the moment.
So you are talking probably about this technique where students have to memorize the outline, the Greeks called or the Latin word for it loci, right? Basically,
Yes.
the location. As in this room, in this house, you place basically the general musical idea, so to say, and then you can elaborate endlessly in various hundreds of ways later on in real situation. But you memorize the structure of it, right?
Yes, exactly. And starting with the 18th century, that was still so steeped in rhetoric, is very important for anyone who wants to improvise in a 19th century or 20th century or any kind of modern style, as long as it's a pattern-based language, such as Messiaen. Messiaen used pattern-based language, and the octatonic mode is pattern-based because there's a pattern within the mode itself. So this pedagogy or this approach works extremely well to transfer then into other eras. But if it's grounded with the foundation of the 18th century, there will be a much stronger sense of harmony, how harmony works and how harmony can be expanded tertially, how form can be expanded in terms of time and space, that the harmonic motion slows down in the 19th century, but the pieces become much longer, the forms become bigger as well. So this 18th century, I think the thorough bass and harmonizations, the chorales, and as well as this Greek model of the architectural blueprint all work together for any type of improvisation, but grounded in the 18th century.
That's fascinating, Pamela. It really opens many, I think, important routes to take, right, for the student. And in your chapter about counterpoint and chorale partitas, you talk about the difference between the Palestrina style counterpoint, right, and the Bach style counterpoint. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, thank you for asking that question, Vidas. It's a very important question, and one I struggled with as I was writing this book, because I discovered that as I taught counterpoint, I could not find a counterpoint text that I thought worked well, because almost every counterpoint text has tried to build some sort of bridge between 16th century counterpoint, which was modal counterpoint, and there are different rules for how the cadences work in modal counterpoint, and 18th century counterpoint, which is tonal counterpoint, and is somewhat influenced by harmony, although it's primarily a linear concept. So I struggled with that as I was teaching counterpoint and couldn't find a text that I found was consistent in its approach. And so I thought, well, okay, with counterpoint in Bach und Fuchs's Gradus ad Parnassum, I will use Fuchs. But I fell into the same trap. And the trap is that Fuchs was using 16th century counterpoint, even though he was writing in the 18th century. So those 16th century counterpoint, the species counterpoint that we know of note against note with whole notes and then half notes against whole notes in second species and quarter notes against whole notes in third species and so on. This was what Fuchs advocated, but he advocated it using modes. He was using mostly chant melodies or melodies he had made up within a mode. If we transfer that and try to use chorales, which is what I was trying to do because Bach used chorales, the mistake I made was that the cadences will not always work in Fuchsian counterpoint because the cadences in the chorales, the chorale melodies sometimes land on the third scale degree, which makes an improper cadence in a mode. And so I am in the process of reworking this counterpoint part. Almost all of the applications work in the counterpoint section. This is chapter 5 of my book, but there are 2 or 3 pages that I plan to improve on and then offer to anyone who emails me the revision, as well as I will publish a revised edition of the book to acknowledge my mistake and the trap I fell into and try to clarify the difference between 16th and 18th century counterpoint. It must have been confusing even in Bach's day if Fuchs was still using 16th century counterpoint. And I know it's confusing to theory scholars around the world today yet as well. So I'll take this to heart and keep working on it.
But I think, Pamela, it's not a big issue if a student is really committed to learning improvisation, because he or she will feel with his or her intuition, right, what kind of cadence works best for the chorale, regardless of the Fuchsian rules, right?
Yes. Well, and another point is that I was using the counterpoint to lead into the chorale partitas because sometimes the bacchinium makes for a nice variation. However, if you study the chorale variations or partitas of Bach, of course, but also the ones that are a little bit more textbook accessible to new improvisers, such as Johann Pachelbel's chorale partitas, Georg Böhm's partitas, you'll find that they very often use, or much more often use 3 or 4 voices than they use 2 voices. So I also will just get started taking a more harmonic approach to the chorale variations and then talk separately about the bacchinium, but in the 18th century. So I think the 16th century counterpoint is a good exercise in the sense that it is very step-by-step with the note values and how to figure out how to make 2 notes, note against note, sound good, but then also how to put 4 notes against 1 note. And the 4 notes against 1 note is what occurs a lot in chorale partitas. So and then we call it figuration, right? We're making a 4-note figure on 1 note against 1 note in the bass.
Yes.
And that's very typical in the variations both in the Baroque era, but also when you get into Mozart, Beethoven variations, the same types of figures still exist.
You know what I found especially valuable in your book is the list, or a list of these figures, 3 or 4 note figures you describe and present with their original names. That's very, very useful for students who want to, incorporate in their bag of tricks, so to say, and then later use them in improvisation.
Yes, and thanks for bringing that up as well, Vidas. What I've found when I work with beginning improvisers is they find that list very helpful, and many of them find one particular figure. So let's say we're moving with an ascending second in the chorale melody, so da da da, and then we need to fill in 4 notes starting on let's say the G, moving to an A. So then da 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 bum, 1, 2, 3, 4 dum. Many students find that figure to fit under the fingers very nicely. And they might just practice that figure alone with a whole chorale melody such as Freudig, which I love to start with because it has mostly stepwise motion. And so it's possible to practice primarily one interval, the second, the interval of a second, and one figuration. And then what they'll discover is that that figuration works well much of the time, but sometimes it doesn't sound quite right, especially if there's a leading tone in the bass, because it might create parallel octaves with the melody. Sometimes it just gets too repetitive, so then they need to change it up. But it's a good idea, actually, to just start with 1 or 2 figures, practice them so those are in what you call the bag of tricks, and then add a third figure, and then a fourth. And pretty soon, all of a sudden, all of these figures feel comfortable under the fingers, and they're all accessible within a set of variations or a chorale partita, and they can be used in sequence or in contrast to one another. And it really is quite like solving a puzzle. I've always loved doing puzzles or Sudoku and things like that, and it's very much a challenge like that becomes more and more fun the more you do it.
Exactly. Challenge or labyrinth of chorale partitas, right?
Yes.
And you solve and you try to find one of the hundreds of entrances into the labyrinth and then go out safely.
Right. Exactly.
So these chorale partitas, basically what we know from Bach's output, they were probably created earlier in life, right? When he was when he was basically a young man, right?
Yes, some of his earliest chorale preludes, the Neumeister collection, as well as some of the chorale preludes.
So I was just touching barely to this teenager collection that was quite recently discovered, the Neumeister collection of the chorales, and you probably incorporate those in your book too.
Yes, I did. It's very interesting to meet the young Bach. We don't have everything from when Bach was very young, to see, to witness, and to hear his compositional evolution, but to also look at some of his early compositions as an improviser, because those of us who enter improvisation after we've been playing repertoire for a long time realize that we can't improvise at the level that we can play repertoire immediately without putting in the same number of hours of practice into the improvisation. So the Neumeister are quite delightful. They have some techniques such as echo effects that we see in the chorale fantasies, for instance, of Tünder and Buxtehude. And so we see some influence from the generation before Bach coming into his work when he's in his youthful collection of the Neumeister that doesn't appear so much anymore later, even in the Orgelbüchlein, let alone the Schubler chorales or the Leipzig chorales, his later organ preludes. And I think that's refreshing for an improviser to be able to see that progression, and also even maybe find a few things that could have been a little stronger in the early Bach, because of course we find that in ourselves when we improvise as well.
That's amazing, Pamela. When Bach was a teenager, he probably felt the great influence of North German organ school through Böhm, through Reinken, right? And
Yes.
that is mirrored in these basically Neumeister collection chorales.
Yes. Yes, it's fascinating.
Fascinating. And how he developed later when he was in about his 40s, and he started create the dance suites, right? Your last chapter in your treatise deals with the dance suites. Tell us a little bit what you learned from the concept of creating dance suites and its relationship with the chorale.
Yes, I can preface this to say I wanted to experience the physical motion of dance. And I was fortunate when I was working in Sweden, in Göteborg, with the Go Art project to discover that Hans Davidsson is not only a wonderful project leader and organist and pedagogue, but he also is a wonderful dancer, as are both of his sons. They're professional dancers. And so one summer when I was there, Hans and I worked with a woman, Satoko Berger, who was a professional Baroque dance choreographer. She had studied treatises on dance. And I was at the harpsichord, and Hans and Satoko learned couples dances to the movements of that we associate with the dance suite, especially the courante, the sarabande, the minuet, and the gigue. The allemande was actually never a dance in the 18th century. It was considered more of a prelude to the other dances. And I learned so much from working with them with the physical action, because that if the gigues and the minuets, for instance, the dancers need to be hopping, and of course they can't stay in the air indefinitely because of gravity, and that says a lot about tempo to a musician, what tempo is appropriate, and therefore how much figuration is appropriate or possible in that. And it was a wonderful learning experience. So I went from the physical aspect of dancing then to some of the treatises of Bach's contemporaries. So Friedrich Erhard Nietzsche wrote the Musikalische Handleitung, and Bach owned that treatise, and it was in his library. And Nietzsche tried to teach his readers about creating dance improvisations and or compositions based on a thorough baseline. So he's using part of what Bach talked about early on with the thorough bass. And so Nietzsche gave us just a thorough baseline with all quarter notes. And then he said, if you want to make this baseline into a courante, you need to put it in a triple meter and make the first note have twice the value of the third note in the measure, so that 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 rhythm would result, that meter would result, and that would be the basis of the courante. And so he went through various dances and taught his readers how to change the meter and then adjust the placement of the notes according to the dance meters. Meanwhile, Johann Mattheson, worked on teaching his readers how to create dances, how to improvise dances, but he started from the top instead, and he used chorale melodies. So we have, between Nietzsche and Mattheson, we have the chorale melody plus the thorough bass that we started out with Bach's pedagogy to his students, just in learning how to harmonize and fill in alto and tenor. That pedagogy remains. With half of it with Mattheson, half of it with Nietzsche. And I thought, well, why not? If Bach used both melody and baseline early on, then let's continue that with the dance suites. It makes perfect sense, because then Mattheson again adjusted the rhythms. For instance, he gives the Wie schön leuchtet melody, and he says if you see it as the chorale, but if you want it to be a gavotte has a double quarter note pickup, or anacrusis. So he shows right in his treatise how would an improviser or composer take a chorale melody and set it to a dance meter so that it's possible to improvise with that. So I proceed with that and give characteristics of each dance, and then applications with little incipits showing what are the characteristics of the allemande. Okay, how can you take this chorale melody and this thorough bass and turn it into an allemande? How can you do the same for courante, a sarabande, a minuet, and a gigue?
So that's, Pamela, very amazing work you do in your volume one. I think people around the world will be excited to basically explore your ideas and insights, and also wait eagerly for volume two.
Yes, thank you. Volume 2 is nearly finished. I have, there are 7 chapters in this. This is free works and continuo, but I'll give you a little trailer, so to say, for the volume 2. It also makes some use of chorale melodies and thorough bass. That idea continues even in free works, because I've discovered that very often we can find some sort of a chorale melody influence, if not even direct quote, in some of the works of Bach and his contemporaries. That I think they were so steeped in playing chorales as liturgical musicians that either inadvertently or consciously became part of the blueprint then for the free works, which comprise of interludes and cadenzas, preludes and fantasias, a nice large section on continuo playing, because Bach's continuo playing sounded a lot different than what we hear frequently today with continuo playing, and I show many reasons why that is. Partimento, Fuguete, and then Fugues. And that volume should be out in early 2016, and I hope to visit with you about that at another point.
Absolutely, Pamela. Thank you so much for your work. It means very much, I think, to all the lovers of historical-based improvisation. And for the last part of our conversation, can you tell our listeners how they can connect with you online and with your work, with your book?
Sure. I have a website at www.PamelaRuiter-Feenstra.com, and it's PamelaRuiter-Feenstra, and perhaps you'll see how to spell it also on your wonderful site, Vidas, with that. And also what you'll find is some new materials for children. So if any of your listeners work with children or would like to work with children, there are some resources there. I talked at the beginning of our enjoyable conversation together about the importance of having a childlike attitude, and I've also decided that it's important for children to have the opportunity to improvise early on, and so I've composed over 100 songs that include some improvisation vocally for children, while at the same time teaching them the building blocks of music and of world peace and how to find peace within and soul care and school topics such as math and science and language arts. So more about that later.
So thanks so much, Pamela, for your insights and generosity, for sharing your ideas, and I wish you great musical adventures in the future as you explore those in your work, in your improvisations, and in your compositions.
Well, thank you so much, Vidas, and for your inspiration of taking the storytelling and making that come to life in your wonderful organ improvisations that you are offering now in various places in the world. I hope your subscribers will enjoy all of that. I'm sure they will. I think they're terrific, and I commend you on your work.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I'm flattered. So we'll keep in touch and keep me posted on your work in volume 2.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. If you liked this conversation, I encourage you to visit my blog Secrets of Organ Playing at organduo.lt, where you will find lots of insights, practical advice, and training for every area of organ playing. You can subscribe to this blog for free to get your daily dose of inspiration and to be the first to know when any of my future podcasts roll out. I hope to help you reach your dreams in organ playing. I'm Vidas Pinkevicius. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you online really soon.